Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. Have you ever gone to another country? Well, if you've been out of the country, or even if you haven't, you're probably aware of the fact that when you travel, you need to change your currency, which should be the dollar, for another country's currency, because that's the currency that they're going to expect you to use when you're paying for goods and services. There's a picture here of different currencies from around the world, and as you probably also know, one currency in relation to another fluctuates, typically. If you've had to change your currency out before you went to another country, or perhaps once you arrived in that country, maybe you went to a place like this one in this picture. You can find them at airports typically, but that's not the only place you can go. You can go to banks in a more traditional sense, and they tell you when you get there what $1 is worth in terms of another currency. We call this the exchange rate. Exchange rate is also known as the price of a currency in terms of another currency. And in this example, as you can see, on April 30th, 2010, at this time, $1 exchanged for, you guessed it, $1. But what if you need to exchange it for yen? Well, at that time, the going rate was 94.20 yen. Or if you needed a euro, because you weren't going to Japan, you were going to Europe. And not every country in Europe is on the euro standard. They're not all considered to be in the eurozone. But let's say you were traveling to Europe and you needed some euros to use, then at that time $1 was worth 0.7479 euros. It's actually more like 0.7479 euro. It's because it's less than 1 euro, of course. Let's say you had some yen already and you needed to exchange it for US dollars. 1 yen at that time would have been worth a fraction of a US dollar. It would have been worth an even smaller fraction in terms of euros, and so forth. Well, how do these prices get determined? We call these prices the nominal exchange rate as opposed to the real exchange rate because they're just plain old numbers, nominal terms, current numbers at a point in time. Those prices are determined by supply and demand. There are markets for currency, just like there are markets for all kinds of other things. We've talked about plenty of examples throughout this course. However, since governments issue currency, governments have more power to influence these kinds of markets and these prices than other prices. But just think of exchange rates or markets where people go to buy and sell currency, like other markets, markets for eyeglasses, markets for legal services, and so forth. Now, when a country has a currency, they have to make a decision about what they're going to do with regards to the way that they'll approach exchange of their currency for another currency. And there's two general approaches, although there are some in-between spots. An exchange rate regime is a fancy way of saying the rule governing policy towards this whole issue of exchange rates. One exchange rate regime is known as floating or flexible exchange rate, which is what we have in the United States. This is when the government lets the exchange rate go wherever the market takes it. Or you could have a fixed exchange rate regime, when the government keeps the exchange rate at or near a particular target. This section we're just going to focus on how exchange rates are determined in a world where the forces of supply and demand are allowed to act relatively freely. The flexible or floating exchange rate system. So think about this example. Let's say we have the United States and we have Mexico. And look up here at row A. Let's say that there is U.S. demand for some Mexican goods. There are some Americans who want to buy some Mexican stuff. Well, typically, the vendors, the producers in Mexico are going to expect you to pay them in pesos. So, we as Americans, if we're the ones interested in buying those Mexican goods, are going to create a demand for Mexican pesos in order to buy those Mexican goods. And how are we going to get those pesos? We're going to supply US dollars in exchange for those Mexican pesos so that we can do this transaction. There's also a reverse of this kind of transaction where Mexicans are looking to buy US goods. So if that was the case, you would have them demanding US dollars in order to buy those US goods. And how do they get them? they supply Mexican pesos in order to get those US dollars and buy those US goods. Where these transactions take place are places that we call the foreign exchange markets for each of those currencies. So in this example, on the left-hand side, we have the market for the peso. On the right-hand side, we have the market for the dollar. And these are two different markets, but they're connected, especially when you start thinking about how the value or the price of one currency is stated in the value or price, or is connected rather, to the supply and demand for currency in another market. So hopefully this will make sense for you once I redo these diagrams, but for now I've got arrows that I've drawn to show you how one demand curve in one market is kind of tied on a string to a supply curve in the other market. So if in our original transaction these Americans who are demanding Mexican goods, who need Mexican pesos to buy them, are going to be demanding them. Where are they going to be demanding the Mexican peso? Well, in the market for the peso, which is down here, and this is the demand curve for the Mexican peso. But just like with any other market, there's a demand curve and a supply curve. This is the supply curve for the Mexican peso. But they're going to be supplying their US dollars, so that supply curve is found in the US market for US dollars. And this curve and the other curve are kind of tied on a string. Because if you stop and think about this, if Americans have to trade in their dollars to get pesos, what they're doing in reality is supplying out there in the world, the market for dollars, their dollars. So they're going to be increasing the supply of dollars in that market, and at the same time demanding pesos in the peso market. And that's why these two are tied on a string. Conversely, in the second transaction here, the other two curves are tied on a string. Now, it might be a little easier for you if you take a look at how I'm in the habit of labeling these markets. If you want to stick with these labels the way that they're drawn in the diagram that I've copied and pasted here, that's perfectly fine. Some people feel perfectly comfortable labeling this axis exchange rate and then the one currency price in terms of the other currency. But when you write it this way, it's kind of the flip in terms of order than what it is down here. If you've got the quantity of some currency, the name of that currency usually comes second over here, and that can be confusing for people. So this is the US dollar market, and down here, easy enough, just like with any market, you're going to put quantity of whatever is being sold in that market. So this is the quantity of dollars, and up here your first instinct would be price of the dollar, right? I mean, you've got quantity of something, price of that thing. But you flip the terminology and it becomes a little confusing for people because it's the peso price per dollar. Same thing over here, the dollar price per peso in the peso market. So if that makes perfect sense to you, great, but most of the students that I've taught in the past prefer labeling it this way. So you have the foreign exchange market for Mexican pesos and the foreign exchange market for US dollars. First of all, our previous example did not have a title at the top of these markets, so make sure you include these titles. But I like to write each of these in more intuitive ways. So once again, you have the quantity of pesos along this axis, and then you have the price of pesos in dollars. Price of pesos, quantity of pesos, very direct. Same thing with any other currency. Let's say it's a foreign exchange market for US dollars. Quantity of dollars, price of dollars. But it's the price of dollars in pesos. So that's important that you still include that piece, but the order is just a little bit different. And just like with any other market out there, you have the supply curve and the demand curve, and you can keep it nice and simple. You don't have to label these curves as fancily as we saw in the previous example. You can just do S sub 1 and D sub 1. Same thing with the equilibriums, P sub 1 and Q sub 1. Make your life easy. There's no reason to use the other labeling if you find it awkward. So, that being said, of course changes can take place in these markets. And once again, you have this curve and this curve tied on a string. I'll put blue triangles around them to remind you of that, and then we'll put a box around this and this to remind you that those two curves are tied together on a string. And as a curve moves, then the curve that's attached to it moves in the same direction. So let's say that the U.S. has some citizens that need some pesos. What are they going to do? They're going to supply their dollars, so that's an increase in the supply of dollars, in exchange for demanding pesos. So as I said, these two curves, which are tied on a string, will move in the same direction. So supply goes right over there, demand goes right over here. And then of course any arrows you need to show change, you need to add, along with new labels like you would in any other market. We've done this all before. And when it's all said and done for this kind of an example, what happens? What happens to the price of the US dollar? Well, as supply goes to the right, the price of the dollar in peso decreases. We're not as concerned with these exchange markets with the quantity as we are with the price, because that's what exchange rates are all about. What happens to the price of the peso as a result of this same transaction? After demand shifts to the right, the price increases. Now you've probably already noticed this above. If we have an increase in the value or price of a currency in terms of another currency, we call that appreciation. So we're saying that in this market, with this example, the peso is appreciating in value. It's increasing in value because its price is going up. And in this market, the US dollar is decreasing in value or decreasing in price. We say that it's depreciating in value. Now, of course, we can have other examples of curves shifting in different directions. But the way that I usually like to think about things is who's supplying their currency out there. The people that are supplying their currency will always have their supply curve shift to the right. And then the currency in the other market will have its demand curve shift to the right. Let's say that we didn't have this kind of an example. We had a different example where Mexicans were supplying their currency in order to get US dollars and buy American stuff. Well, then their supply curve would shift to the right, so you would draw S sub 1 shifting to the right to S sub 2. Then of course the price or the value of the peso would decrease, it would depreciate in value. And since this curve is attached to this one, when this one moves to the right, the demand for US dollars will also shift right, and the value or the price of the US dollar will increase. It will appreciate. So those are just the basic mechanics of how price, value, in each of two foreign exchange markets affect each other. They're connected. It's really useful. I definitely recommend you practice doing this, as basic as it seems, so that you get very comfortable with it. But why do we care about all that? Besides the fact that if you're going to go on a European vacation, you're hoping that the dollar is strong enough compared to the euro that you can buy a lot of stuff when you're in Europe. You may have had a trip, whether it's to Europe or to other parts of the world, where you went to trade in your currency and you said, wow, this isn't worth as much as I remember it being. Why? Well, that brings us to this. Appreciation in a currency leads to certain things for individuals, but more importantly, because this is where our focus is, for entire countries. Think about this. If you have an appreciation in a currency, the value of the currency, the price of the currency goes up. Certain things, ceteris paribus, could follow. If you have appreciation in a currency, that could lead to the goods of that country becoming more expensive compared to the goods of a foreign country. So let's say you're going to trade in your currency to go on a European vacation, and the European currency, the euro, perhaps, appreciates in value. Why is that bad news for an American like you and me? Because now that means their stuff is more expensive. Maybe you had a plan to buy some great, buy a purse, or to buy some other kind of souvenir that you wanted to bring back. Well, now it's going to be more expensive to you because there's an appreciation in that currency. But in the big picture, this decreases their exports and decreases their aggregate demand, because NX is one of those components of aggregate demand, and in the big picture, ceteris paribus, that would decrease employment, decrease income, decrease output, as well as the price level, and increase unemployment, assuming nothing else changes, ceteris paribus. Why would we care about the depreciation in a currency? Because, ceteris paribus, that could lead to the goods of that country becoming less expensive. It will lead to the goods of that country becoming less expensive compared to the goods of a foreign country, which leads to an increase in exports, which leads to an increase in AD, which leads to an increase in employment, incomes, output, the price level, and a decrease in unemployment. So that's why we care, of course, because it affects individuals like you and me who are traveling, who are buying and selling, and it affects an entire country. Now, what are the factors that would cause this to happen in the first place? 3 different factors. One is a difference in income growth rates. So, if country A's income grows faster than the incomes in country B, consumers in country A will tend to buy more of everything in their circular flow, including imports. So country A will supply their currency and demand the foreign currency of country B to buy those foreign products if they were already buying some of those. Country A's currency will depreciate and country B's currency will appreciate. So, go back to our example. If the United States was country A and Mexico was country B, this is what it would look like. We would supply our currency in order to buy Mexican goods if our incomes were going up faster than incomes in Mexico. Another factor, differences in relative inflation rates. If country A, let's keep thinking about it as the United States, country A's price level rises faster than country B's, goods in country B will become relatively less expensive. Their prices are going up not as fast. Or, who knows, maybe their prices haven't gone up at all, or they've experienced deflation. All that matters is the difference between the two countries, just like the difference in the two countries' incomes. You could say the same thing there, as a matter of fact. If the United States is country A, our incomes are going up at all, and incomes in Mexico are decreasing, it would have the same impact. But what about differences in relative inflation rates? If country A's price level rises faster than country B's, goods in country B become relatively less expensive, so consumers from country A will buy more of country B's cheaper goods. So country A will supply their currency and demand the foreign currency of country B to buy those foreign products. Same thing in the diagram we just showed. Country A's currency will depreciate, country B's currency will appreciate. Last factor, changes in real interest rates. If country B's real interest rates in the loanable funds market, real interest rates in their loanable funds market rise faster than country A's, then investors looking for the highest interest rates possible are going to send their money to the place that their money can make the most money. If you're looking for a place to put your money, whether it's in your country or another country, just think of it in terms of savings accounts. Okay, you're going to put your money in the place that's going to pay you the highest rate of savings. If there's some other country where they're paying 3% on savings accounts and they'll take your money, as opposed to Bank of America, you might find a way to send your money over there if Bank of America is only paying you 1%. So think of it that way. And if country B's real interest rates in that loanable funds market rise faster than country A's, investors looking for higher interest rates are going to send their money from country A over to country B's loanable funds market. So country A, once again, will supply their currency and demand the foreign currency of country B to make more money. Country A's currency will depreciate, and country B's currency will appreciate. So, three different factors that could cause something like this. Incomes are going faster over here going up faster in the United States than they are in Mexico, or inflation is going up faster over here than it is in Mexico, or real interest rates in Mexico's loanable funds market are going up faster. So once again, we supply our currency to them in exchange for that peso so that we can invest our newly acquired pesos in these new places for savings in Mexico. Of course, all the same things can happen in reverse. And this last point is pretty interesting. Think about those markets that we just showed you, and also the loanable funds market where you find these real interest rates. When it comes to changes in real interest rates, there's an interesting dynamic here. Because of this whole dynamic, a country that uses a flexible exchange rate regime isn't completely at the whims of the exchange market. It might seem like that on the surface. You have individuals making decisions about where to send their money, where to get the best deal to buy stuff, where to put their money for savings so that it can grow as fast as possible. And the government's just kind of going, well, you know what, we support a flexible exchange rate policy, so, whatever happens, happens. Well, not exactly. Although a country with a flexible regime doesn't directly try to control the exchange rate, its central bank could influence it. Because if a central bank in a country with flexible exchange rates decreases its interest rates, from the monetary policy unit that a central bank like the Fed in the United States can influence interest rates. You know about the tools that it has at its disposal to do so. And if they were to decrease interest rates, that would, as you know, increase the C and the I because loans are cheaper, and it would increase NX. Because stop and think about this. Since the country's currency will depreciate, increasing exports and reducing imports, that could also be a part of macroeconomic policy, macroactivism. So spend some time letting that sink in. You could have a central bank decreasing interest rates not just to increase the C and the I, but the NX, since the country's currency will depreciate when they do that. All right, money's going to flow out of the country, trying to find places where they can find better savings rates. But as the currency comes down, now it becomes cheaper for people to buy that country's stuff. It's going to increase exports and reduce imports, which of course are all components of AD. The C, the I, the G, and the NX are all components of AD. And so AD increases, and this leads, of course, to an increase in employment, income, output, and a decrease in unemployment. Ah, how nice. One last thing. Once in a while, not very often, they talk in this class about real exchange rates. These are exchange rates that are adjusted for international differences in aggregate price levels. I've talked so much about how we care more about real than nominal, and most of this talk is all in nominal terms. But if you ever had to do a short and quick conversion to find a real exchange rate, then you would find it by taking the price, the exchange rate of a currency, let's say currency A, in terms of currency B, and then multiply that by the price level of country A divided by the price level of country B.